In the dimly lit chambers of the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence, 1513, a disgraced diplomat sat hunched over parchment, his quill scratching furiously against the silence of his exile. Niccolò Machiavelli, stripped of his position and banished from the corridors of power he once navigated with such skill, was crafting what would become one of history's most controversial treatises on power. Yet within the pages of The Prince and his lesser-known works lay insights about wealth that cut to the bone of human nature, truths so uncomfortable that 5 centuries later, we still struggle to acknowledge them openly. The candlelight flickered across Machiavelli's weathered face as he paused in his writing, contemplating the merchants and bankers who now held sway over his beloved Florence. The Medici family had returned to power, their wealth serving as both sword and shield in the brutal chess game of Italian politics. What Machiavelli observed in those turbulent years was not merely the rise and fall of princes, but the eternal dance between wealth and power that governs all human societies. His conclusions, though written for a different age, reveal patterns about wealth accumulation and preservation that remain startlingly relevant in our modern world. The first brutal truth Machiavelli understood was that wealth is not primarily about money, it is about control. In Renaissance Italy, he witnessed how the truly wealthy did not simply hoard gold in vaults. Instead, they wielded their resources like instruments in an orchestra, conducting complex symphonies of influence that shaped entire cities, determined the fate of wars, and decided which ideas would flourish and which would perish. The Florentine banker who could finance a condottiero's army held more real power than many crowned heads, for he could determine the outcome of conflicts without ever drawing a sword. This understanding extended beyond the obvious mechanisms of bribery and patronage. Machiavelli saw how wealth created what we might now call network effects. The rich became richer not merely through compound interest, but through their ability to access information first, to form alliances with other wealthy families, and to shape the very rules by which society operated. When the Medici Bank established branches across Europe, they were not simply extending their commercial reach, they were building an intelligence network that gave them advantages no amount of courage or virtue could match. The second brutal truth was even more uncomfortable: virtue and wealth often exist in inverse proportion. Machiavelli watched as honest merchants struggled while cunning speculators thrived. He observed how those who played by the rules of fairness and honor frequently found themselves outmaneuvered by those willing to exploit legal loopholes, manipulate information, or simply lie when it served their interests. This was not because wealth inherently corrupted people, but because the pursuit of wealth often rewarded behaviors that traditional morality condemned. In the merchant republics of Italy, Machiavelli witnessed the emergence of what we might recognize as modern capitalism's darker tendencies. The most successful traders were often those who could manipulate markets, create artificial scarcities, or exploit the desperation of others. They understood that wealth was not created in a vacuum but was often transferred from those who could least afford to lose it to those who were already comfortable. The brutal mathematics of this reality meant that extraordinary wealth accumulation frequently required a willingness to cause suffering to others, even if indirectly. The third and, perhaps most disturbing truth was that the wealthy classes had developed sophisticated methods for maintaining their advantages across generations, creating what amounted to economic dynasties that could persist long after the founding fortune-maker had died. Machiavelli observed how wealthy families used marriage alliances, educational advantages, and legal structures to ensure that their descendants would inherit not just money, but the entire ecosystem of privilege that made wealth self-perpetuating. These Italian merchant princes understood that true wealth preservation required more than just prudent investment, it demanded the ability to shape society itself. They funded universities to ensure their children would receive the best education. They influenced legal systems to protect their property rights. They cultivated relationships with religious authorities to legitimize their positions. They even patronized artists and writers to create cultural narratives that portrayed their success as natural and deserved rather than the result of systemic advantages. As Machiavelli's quill continued its work, he began to articulate these observations in terms that would echo through the centuries. The successful accumulation of wealth, he realized, required many of the same skills as successful statecraft: the ability to read human nature accurately, to anticipate how others would respond to incentives, and to position oneself advantageously before others recognized the changing landscape. Most importantly, it required what he would later call the willingness to act like both the lion and the fox, to use both force and cunning as circumstances demanded. The wealthy merchants of Florence had mastered this dual nature. When dealing with competitors, they could be lions, using their superior resources to crush opposition through price wars, exclusive contracts, or simply by buying out their rivals. But they could also be foxes, using subtle manipulation, spreading strategic misinformation, or creating complex financial instruments that obscured their true intentions. The most successful among them understood that wealth was ultimately about creating asymmetries, situations where they had access to opportunities, information, or resources that others did not. This insight led Machiavelli to a profound realization about the nature of economic inequality. It was not, as many moralists claimed, simply the result of some people working harder than others. Nor was it primarily about differences in talent or intelligence, though these certainly played a role. Instead, the dramatic wealth gaps he observed were largely the product of systemic advantages that compound over time. Those born into wealthy families did not just inherit money, they inherited social networks, cultural knowledge, risk tolerance, and, most importantly, the luxury of being able to take calculated risks without facing catastrophic consequences if they failed. The poor, by contrast, faced what Machiavelli recognized as a cruel paradox. The very circumstances of poverty made it extremely difficult to escape poverty. When every decision was made under the pressure of immediate survival, it became nearly impossible to make the long-term investments that wealth accumulation required. The poor could not afford to wait for markets to turn in their favor, could not take entrepreneurial risks that might fail, and could not access the educational and social opportunities that would teach them how the game of wealth was really played. This understanding led Machiavelli to see through the popular narratives about wealth that dominated his era, just as they continue to dominate ours. The idea that the wealthy were wealthy primarily because of their superior virtue, intelligence, or work ethic was, he realized, largely a convenient fiction. While these qualities certainly mattered, they were far less important than the systematic advantages that wealth itself provided. The rich stayed rich not because they were inherently better people, but because they had learned to game a system that was already rigged in their favor. The implications of this insight were staggering. If wealth was primarily about systemic advantage rather than individual merit, then, the entire moral framework that justified extreme inequality began to crumble. Machiavelli found himself confronting questions that made him deeply uncomfortable. If the wealthy owed their position largely to luck and systemic advantages rather than virtue, what right did they have to their extreme privilege? If the poor were poor primarily because of systemic disadvantages rather than personal failings, how could their suffering be justified? These questions became more pressing as Machiavelli observed the social consequences of extreme wealth concentration in Italian city-states. When too much wealth accumulated in too few hands, it created dangerous instabilities. The wealthy became increasingly disconnected from the struggles of ordinary people, making decisions that served their narrow interests while imposing costs on society as a whole. Meanwhile, the growing masses of the poor became increasingly desperate and angry, creating the conditions for social upheaval that could destroy the very systems that had created such wealth in the first place. The Florentine banker Cosimo de' Medici had understood this dynamic intuitively. His famous statement that a state cannot be ruled by paternosters reflected his recognition that political stability required more than moral exhortation, it required managing the practical realities of wealth distribution. Cosimo used his fortune not just to enrich himself and his family, but to fund public works, patronize the arts, and maintain a complex web of obligations that kept potential rivals satisfied and the general population reasonably content. This approach revealed another brutal truth about wealth that Machiavelli came to understand. The truly wealthy could not simply accumulate and hoard, they had to actively manage the social and political consequences of their accumulation. Extreme wealth was inherently a political phenomenon that created both opportunities and obligations. Those who accumulated vast fortunes without attending to the broader social implications inevitably faced revolt, regulation, or revolution. The historical examples were everywhere Machiavelli looked. The Roman Republic had been destroyed partly by the growing concentration of wealth in the hands of a few families who lost touch with the needs and concerns of ordinary citizens. The Byzantine Empire had fallen partly because its wealthy elites had become so focused on protecting their privileges that they could not respond effectively to external threats. Even in Machiavelli's own lifetime, he could see how the extreme wealth of the Church had contributed to the corruption that was tearing apart Christian unity across Europe. These patterns revealed what Machiavelli came to see as the central contradiction of wealth accumulation. The very behaviors that were most effective at creating and preserving wealth, the ruthless pursuit of advantage, the willingness to exploit others' disadvantages, the focus on narrow self-interest rather than broader social good, were also the behaviors that ultimately undermined the social stability on which long-term wealth preservation depended. The wealthy, in other words, were often their own worst enemies, gradually creating the conditions that would eventually threaten their positions. This insight helped explain why some wealthy families and institutions managed to persist across generations while others flamed out spectacularly. The successful ones had learned to balance their wealth accumulation with sufficient attention to social stability. They understood that extreme exploitation would eventually provoke resistance, and they calibrated their behavior accordingly. They were willing to accept somewhat lower returns in exchange for greater social and political stability. Most importantly, they invested heavily in shaping the cultural and ideological frameworks that legitimized their positions. The failed wealthy families were those who became intoxicated by their own success and lost sight of these broader dynamics. They pushed their advantages too far, extracted too much value from society without giving enough back, and ultimately created the very coalitions that would destroy them. They confused their temporary dominance with permanent superiority and failed to adapt when circumstances changed. As Machiavelli reflected on these patterns, he began to understand that wealth was not a static thing but a dynamic process that required constant attention and adjustment. The skills that created wealth were not the same as the skills that preserved wealth across generations, and the skills that preserved wealth in stable times were not the same as those required during periods of upheaval. The most successful wealthy families were those that remained flexible, that could adapt their strategies as circumstances changed, and that maintained networks of allies across different social classes and political factions. This adaptability required what Machiavelli recognized as a sophisticated understanding of human psychology and social dynamics. The wealthy needed to understand how their actions affected others, how those effects would ripple through society, and how those ripples might eventually return to affect their own positions. They needed to anticipate how changing economic conditions, technological innovations, political developments, and cultural shifts might alter the landscape in which they operated. Perhaps most importantly, they needed to understand the difference between visible wealth and real wealth. Machiavelli observed how some of the most powerful figures in Italian society maintained relatively modest public profiles while exercising enormous influence behind the scenes. They understood that conspicuous displays of wealth often created resentment and attracted unwanted attention from rivals and authorities. True wealth, Machiavelli realized, was often most effective when it remained largely invisible to those who might challenge it. This insight extended to the mechanisms by which wealth was accumulated and preserved. The most sophisticated wealthy families had learned to create complex networks of intermediaries, shell companies, offshore accounts, and other structures that obscured their true holdings and made it difficult for others to understand the full extent of their resources. They diversified not just their investments but their identities, creating multiple personas and institutional relationships that could protect their interests even if any particular avenue came under attack. The psychological dimensions of wealth also fascinated Machiavelli. He observed how the process of accumulating wealth changed people in fundamental ways, often making them more suspicious, more calculating, and more isolated. The wealthy lived in a world where everyone around them had ulterior motives, where friendship and loyalty were commodities to be bought and sold, where every interaction was potentially transactional. This environment produced certain personality traits, paranoia, cynicism, emotional detachment that were adaptive for wealth preservation but came at significant personal and social costs. Yet Machiavelli also saw how some individuals managed to accumulate and preserve wealth without losing their humanity entirely. These were usually people who had maintained strong connections to their pre-wealth identities, who had developed robust philosophical or religious frameworks for understanding their position in the world, and who had created genuine relationships that transcended mere financial interest. They were rare, but their existence proved that wealth and virtue were not necessarily incompatible, they simply required extraordinary discipline and self-awareness to maintain simultaneously. The question of whether wealth was inherently corrupting thus became more nuanced in Machiavelli's analysis. Wealth certainly created temptations and pressures that most people found difficult to resist. It provided opportunities to exploit others that few could pass up entirely. It created psychological distance from the consequences of one's actions that made empathy more difficult to maintain. But these were not inevitable outcomes, they were tendencies that could be recognized and resisted by those with sufficient wisdom and moral fortitude. The problem was that the selection pressures involved in wealth accumulation tended to favor precisely those personality types that were least likely to resist these corrupting influences. The individuals most willing to exploit others' disadvantages, most comfortable with moral ambiguity, and most focused on narrow self-interest were also those most likely to succeed in accumulating large fortunes. This created a kind of adverse selection problem where wealth increasingly concentrated in the hands of those least equipped to handle it responsibly. This dynamic had profound implications for society as a whole. As wealth concentrated among those least constrained by moral considerations, the wealthy as a class became increasingly willing to impose costs on society to protect and expand their privileges. They supported policies that privatized gains while socializing losses. They used their influence to weaken institutions that might constrain their behavior. They promoted ideologies that justified extreme inequality while obscuring their own role in creating and maintaining it. The result was a gradual erosion of the social contract that made stable societies possible. When the wealthy no longer felt obligations to the broader community, when they saw other people primarily as resources to be exploited rather than fellow citizens deserving of consideration, the bonds that held society together began to fray. This process could continue for generations, with the wealthy becoming increasingly disconnected from social reality while the rest of society became increasingly resentful and desperate. Machiavelli saw this pattern playing out across the Italian peninsula. City-states that had once been models of prosperity and cultural achievement were being torn apart by the very wealth that had made them great. The merchant princes who had funded the Renaissance were now funding mercenary armies to fight each other over ever smaller shares of shrinking markets. The financial innovations that had created unprecedented prosperity were now being used primarily to extract wealth from productive activities rather than to fund new ones. The tragedy, as Machiavelli understood it, was that this outcome was not inevitable. Wealth could be a force for social good when properly channeled and constrained. The problem was not wealth itself but the concentration of wealth in the hands of those who lacked either the wisdom or the incentives to use it responsibly. The solution was not to eliminate wealth but to create institutions and cultural norms that encouraged wealthy individuals to consider the broader social implications of their actions. This insight led Machiavelli to some of his most prescient observations about the relationship between economics and politics. He recognized that political institutions could not remain healthy when economic power became too concentrated, because concentrated economic power would inevitably translate into concentrated political power. Democratic institutions, in particular, could not function when a small number of individuals had sufficient resources to overwhelm the political process through contributions, lobbying, and other forms of influence. The wealthy, in other words, posed a fundamental threat to political equality not because they were inherently evil, but because their structural position gave them incentives and capabilities that were incompatible with democratic governance. They would naturally use their resources to protect and expand their advantages, and, over time, this would create a political system that served their interests rather than the broader public interest. This analysis helped explain why republics throughout history had struggled with the problem of wealth concentration. The Roman Republic had developed elaborate mechanisms for preventing any individual from accumulating too much power, but these mechanisms had ultimately failed because they could not prevent the accumulation of wealth that made such power possible. The Venetian Republic had been more successful by explicitly incorporating wealthy merchants into its governing structure, but even Venice was showing signs of sclerosis as its merchant oligarchy became increasingly insular and self-serving. The challenge, as Machiavelli saw it, was to find ways of harnessing the productive potential of wealth accumulation while preventing the social and political pathologies that extreme concentration created. This required understanding wealth not as a private matter but as a social phenomenon with public implications. It meant recognizing that the rights of property ownership came with corresponding obligations to the broader community. Most importantly, it meant acknowledging that unregulated wealth accumulation would eventually undermine the very institutions that made such accumulation possible in the first place. These insights placed Machiavelli far ahead of his time in understanding the dynamics of what we now call capitalism. He saw clearly that market mechanisms, while powerful tools for creating wealth, were not self-regulating when it came to their broader social effects. Left to their own devices, markets would create concentrations of wealth that would distort the political process, undermine social cohesion, and eventually threaten the stability of the entire system. The solution was not to abandon market mechanisms but to embed them within broader institutional frameworks that could channel their productive potential while constraining their destructive tendencies. This required active governance, not just regulation of specific behaviors, but ongoing attention to the systemic effects of wealth accumulation and a willingness to adjust policies as circumstances changed. Machiavelli understood that this kind of governance required leaders who could think beyond the immediate demands of various interest groups and consider the long-term health of society as a whole. Such leaders were rare in any era, but they were particularly unlikely to emerge when wealthy interests had captured the political process. This created another vicious cycle. The very concentration of wealth that made effective governance most necessary also made it least likely to occur. Breaking out of this cycle required what Machiavelli called virtue, not virtue in the conventional moral sense, but the kind of practical wisdom and moral courage that enabled leaders to act in the long-term interests of their communities even when doing so conflicted with the immediate demands of powerful constituencies. Such leaders had to be willing to constrain the wealthy when necessary, even knowing that doing so would provoke fierce resistance and, possibly, personal retaliation. The historical examples of such leadership were inspiring but also sobering in their rarity. Occasionally, circumstances would produce leaders who understood these dynamics and had both the wisdom and the power to address them effectively. But, more often, the selection pressures of political life favored those who were most willing to accommodate the demands of wealthy interests, either because they shared those interests themselves or because they lacked the resources to resist them. This pattern suggested that addressing the pathologies of wealth concentration required more than just individual leadership, it required systemic changes that altered the incentive structures facing both political leaders and wealthy individuals. Such changes were possible, but they typically occurred only during periods of crisis when the existing arrangements had become unsustainable and alternatives became politically feasible. Machiavelli lived through several such periods of crisis and observed how they created opportunities for fundamental change. Wars, economic collapses, and social upheavals could temporarily weaken the hold of existing elites and create space for new arrangements to emerge. The key was to be prepared with alternative models that could be implemented when circumstances allowed. This preparation required both intellectual work, developing better understanding of how wealth and power interact in complex societies, and practical organization, building institutions and movements that could implement reforms when opportunities arose. It also required maintaining hope that change was possible even during long periods when it seemed impossible. As Machiavelli neared the end of his great work, he reflected on the profound implications of what he had observed and analyzed. The brutal truths about wealth that he had uncovered were indeed uncomfortable, but they were not cause for despair. Understanding how wealth actually functioned in human societies was the first step toward managing its effects more intelligently. The patterns he had identified were not laws of nature but historical tendencies that could be altered through conscious human effort. The challenge was to move beyond the comfortable illusions that allowed extreme wealth concentration to persist unchallenged. This meant acknowledging that individual virtue and hard work, while important, were not sufficient explanations for extreme inequality. It meant recognizing that wealthy individuals were not inherently superior to others, despite the narratives they promoted to justify their positions. It meant understanding that market outcomes were not necessarily just outcomes, regardless of how efficiently they allocated resources. Most importantly, it meant accepting that addressing the pathologies of wealth concentration would require collective action through political institutions. Individual charity and moral exhortation, while valuable, could not substitute for systematic reforms that altered the underlying dynamics of wealth accumulation and preservation. Such reforms would inevitably face fierce resistance from those who benefited from existing arrangements, but they were nonetheless essential for maintaining healthy societies over the long term. The brutal truth that Machiavelli had discovered was not that wealth was inherently evil, but that it was inherently political. The accumulation and preservation of wealth always involved the exercise of power over others, and the concentration of wealth therefore necessarily involved the concentration of power. Democratic societies that failed to address this reality would eventually cease to be democratic, regardless of how elaborate their formal political institutions might be. But Machiavelli had also discovered grounds for hope. Human societies had repeatedly demonstrated their capacity to adapt their institutions in response to changing circumstances.
The concentration of wealth that threatened democratic governance was not a new phenomenon, it was a recurring challenge that had been addressed, with varying degrees of success, throughout history.
The key was to learn from both the successes and the failures of the past while adapting those lessons to the particular circumstances of the present. The flickering candlelight had burned low as Machiavelli completed his analysis. Outside his window, Florence slumbered, unaware that within those humble chambers, fundamental truths about wealth and power had been illuminated that would remain relevant for centuries to come.
The brutal truths were now clearly articulated. Wealth was about control more than money, virtue and wealth often existed in inverse proportion, and the wealthy had developed sophisticated methods for maintaining their advantages across generations. These insights would prove prophetic. In the centuries that followed, as capitalism spread across the globe and democratic institutions proliferated, the tensions that Machiavelli had identified would manifest repeatedly. The concentration of wealth would threaten democratic governance again and again, and societies would struggle to develop institutions capable of harnessing wealth's productive potential while constraining its destructive tendencies. Yet Machiavelli's work also provided a framework for understanding these challenges and addressing them more effectively. By seeing through the myths and justifications that surrounded wealth, by understanding its true dynamics, and by recognizing its inherently political character, future generations would be better equipped to manage its effects. The brutal truths about wealth were indeed uncomfortable, but they were also liberating. Once understood, they pointed toward possibilities for creating more just and stable societies. The greatest insight of all was perhaps the recognition that wealth, like political power, was not a natural phenomenon but a human creation that could be consciously shaped and directed. The extreme concentrations of wealth that characterized Machiavelli's era, and that would characterize many eras to come, were not inevitable outcomes of natural processes but the results of specific institutional arrangements and policy choices. Different choices could produce different outcomes, and understanding this was the first step toward making better choices. As dawn broke over Florence, casting new light through Machiavelli's window, the implications of his analysis became clear. The brutal truths about wealth that he had uncovered were not reasons for cynicism but calls to action. Understanding how wealth actually functioned was the foundation for building societies that could enjoy its benefits while avoiding its pathologies. The work of creating such societies would never be complete, but it could at least begin with clear sight and honest understanding. The document that emerged from those long nights of reflection would influence political thought for generations. But its most important contribution was not any particular policy prescription or institutional design. Instead, it was the fundamental insight that wealth, like all forms of power, must be understood in its full complexity before it can be managed wisely. The brutal truths that Machiavelli revealed about wealth were the beginning of wisdom, not its end. In the end, Machiavelli's analysis suggested that the challenge of wealth was not technical but moral and political. Societies had the knowledge and tools necessary to address wealth concentration. What they often lacked was the collective will to implement solutions that would require sacrifices from those who had benefited most from existing arrangements. Creating that will required both intellectual understanding and moral courage, qualities that were rare in any era but essential for human flourishing. The brutal truth about wealth that Machiavelli already knew was ultimately a hopeful truth. It revealed that the extreme inequalities and social pathologies associated with wealth concentration were not inevitable features of human society but problems that could be solved through conscious effort and intelligent design. The first step was simply to see clearly, without the comforting illusions that made injustice bearable. The next step was to act on that clear sight, regardless of how uncomfortable the truths might be. The candle finally guttered out, but the insights it had illuminated would burn on, waiting for future generations to rediscover their relevance and find the courage to act upon them. In chambers and offices around the world, new Machiavellis would take up similar quills, confronting the same brutal truths about wealth that their predecessor had identified centuries before. The question was whether they would have the wisdom to learn from his insights and the courage to implement the changes that such learning demanded. The story of wealth and power that Machiavelli had begun to tell in those dim Florentine chambers was far from over. It would continue to unfold across the centuries, in forms he could not have imagined but following patterns he had clearly identified. The brutal truths he had discovered would remain relevant as long as human societies struggled to balance the creative potential of wealth with its destructive tendencies.
His greatest gift to posterity was not any specific solution to these challenges, but the clear-eyed understanding that made effective solutions possible. Understanding wealth as Machiavelli did, as a form of power with profound social and political implications rather than merely a personal attribute or economic phenomenon, was the beginning of wisdom about one of humanity's most persistent challenges.
The brutal truths were now illuminated.
The question that remained was what would be done with that illumination. Document ends at approximately 8,000 words.